Welcome back. Now, we're going to have a conversation about World Poetry Day. But before we do, here is a short backgrounder.
When at break of day at the riverside, I hear the jungle drums telegraphing, the mystic rhythm, urgent and raw like bleeding flesh, speaking of primal youth and the beginning. I see the panther ready to pounce, the leopard snarling about to leap, and the hunters crouch down with spears poised. And my blood ripples, turns torrent, topples the years, and at once, on my mother's laps, a suckling. At once, I'm walking simple paths with no innovations, rugged, fashioned with the naked warmth of hurrying feet and groping hearts in green leaves and wildfires pulsing.
Poetry speaks to our common humanity and our shared values, transforming the simplest of poems into a powerful catalyst, arranged in words, colored with images, struck with the right meter. The power of poetry has no match. It is an ultimate form of expression that opens doors to others. In Paris in 1999, at the United Nations 30th General Conference, March 21st precisely, poets at the event chose this date to highlight the significance of expanding linguistic variety to create awareness concerning indigenous languages. International Day for Poetry is also to bring attention to the importance of poetry in the conservation of old languages and to celebrate the important role played by poets in the development of contemporary society. The theme for this year's celebration is always to be a poet, even in prose, emphasizing the importance of creativity and beauty in all forms of writing, not just poetry. It's a call to observe and appreciate the role that poetry can have in everyday life. In our continent, poetry is one of the earliest genres. How has African poets and their act transformed the society? This and more forms our discourse on Lens on Africa. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. To carry on today's conversation with me is Professor Vicky Sylvester, a professor of literature, gender and cultural studies. Welcome to Lens in Africa, madam.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you. Also joining us in the show is a poet, novelist, playwright, essayist, thought molder, entrepreneur, and creative connoisseur, Rex Ima Hodomena. It's good to have you in the studio. Good to see you again.
My pleasure. I'm here and delighted to be with Prof here with you.
All right, so I'm going to start with you, Prof. What is poetry and why is it important?
It's easy to say what poetry does than to
Say what it is. Interesting.
But we know that traditionally we had people who sang songs, and orature has been a part of our lives.
Yeah.
And you have kings like Sunjata, people like kings like Shaka the Zulu, who had orators, who testified to their greatness in the songs and praises they gave them.
Yes.
And these generated into what people would begin to write. Traditionally, it was oral.
Okay, so you're saying that poetry, one of the uses of poetry traditionally is part of our culture of transferring history and stories and events.
Yeah.
All right, interesting take on it. Mr. Rex, I'm going to ask you the same question. What is poetry and why is it important?
I would say that poetry is life.
Okay, interesting.
It's life, because one of the things that one of the poets actually that tried to encapsulate into words, what you may say is the definition of poetry is William Wordsworth.
Yeah.
Okay, an English poet, 1770 to 1850. Okay, but he tried to define poetry as, a spontaneous overflow of deep feelings, captured. There are certain things, there are key things,
Yes.
they are in tranquility,
Yeah.
so deep feelings, but
Captured.
yeah, but I would say that poetry, like I said earlier, is life.
Yeah.
Okay, and Prof had also highlighted, the significance in African setting, where our lives are, the trajectory of life,
captured.
Exactly. But I would say this beyond that. Poetry is not just, the capturing of words and then trying to frame them. It's just at the base level, if you ask me.
Yeah.
Poetry is more of the imagination
Okay.
and then inspiration. And then as we go further,
Imagination, inspiration.
yes, as we go further, I would like to, buttress on that against the backdrop of what people always say, like it is, like you mentioned, to transfer history. That's good, but that is really not the real thing, if you ask me. And
Okay.
then, going forward.
All right, we're going to press that in as we
Absolutely.
go along today. So, Prof, I'm going to ask you, poetry is a large part of literature, global literature today, and as you've mentioned, poetry is a strong part of African culture and history. What is Africans' contribution in poetry towards the development of literature generally being like?
Well, historically,
Yeah.
we would say Africans, if you ask me today, Nigeria is at the top of literary growth in the world. And a lot of poets, our best poets, all over the world come from Nigeria. Now, if you say historically, poetry has captured the history of Nigeria more than any other genre. You have, well, we tend to break our poets into first generation, second generation, third, and fourth.
Okay, tell us about some of these generation of poets.
Now, and that's where I'm going. They follow the history.
Yeah.
Our earliest poets, who came in the 50s, during the colonial period, they were focused on colonialism, what was being done at the time, and you will find that many of them praised the Europeans for coming to give them a better life, give them education, and so on and so forth. So that that colonial period, the writers at the time had they dwelt on what colonialists
had done. Could you give us a few examples of some of these writers?
Well, if we look at
Chris Okibo, for example.
No.
That's the second generation.
That's the second generation.
Okay.
I'll come back to
To that, the Flora Wakpas and the Achebes.
Now the second generation is where you have people like Kesley Hayford.
Yes.
You have Gabriel Okara.
Yes.
Who were thinking very much about Gabriel Okara belongs to the first group.
Yeah.
Because you see the tendency of worrying about culture and the traditional, our way of life and the Western way of life, and his poems comes in one of his popular poems, Piano and Drums, signifying the clash of this culture.
It seemed that they were born at a junction, so to speak, where one culture has intersected with the other one, and they were trying to, diagnose or point the way forward. Which way do we go from here?
Yeah. So you have the second generation, but the group that we really want to look at is the third generation, which came in the late 60s and 70s. The group of Soyinka and Senghor. Senghor belongs to the second generation, who would not want to hurt the Europeans. They would try to say something cultural in a way that they may be criticizing, but it shouldn't be seen as us criticizing the West. The third generation, where you have people like Tanure Ojaide, where you have people like, what do you call, West African?
Yes.
And
now this third generation, what is the core of the issues they had to grapple with?
the third generation were critical. They looked at, they had passed through the colonial period. They had passed through the war generations, where the Nigerian Civil War, coups and what have you.
Yes.
And they were critical of the government. They didn't even want to go back to the issues of culture of the second generation. They kept that aside. They were critical. They were rebellious. You have people like Odia Ofemu. You have people like Tanure Ojaide. You have people like what is this, Senegalese. They had gone through a lot in the process of the country's, would you say, traumatic experiences. And they express themselves without fear. If you read Ojaide's poems, there is one, he looks at the what do you call, the parties, and one of the parties had brooms, and he said, "Where would you sweep the dirt?"
Fascinating. All right, let me, Rex is Rex is beeping. He has a lot to say. So I wanted to, take you up on the same question. Now, the contributions, I was talking about the contributions of African poets generally to literature, the global body of literature. And since she has talked a lot about that, maybe we should just go further and begin to talk about Africa is beset of many problems, social, economic, political. There are many problems. Here we are sitting talking about poetry. Is it really significant? Can poetry really change, transform society, help a person become better? Why should we be talking about poetry when there's hunger, there's sickness, there's development, there are many things that happen? Can poetry contribute to the development of the African society? And has it done so?
I think I'm happy that you asked that question, because I mentioned earlier that beyond the normative concept that people have about poetry and literature in general, people's transfer of history, morals, all those kind of, they are very okay. But I think that the creative impulse that poetry and literature in general prompts in the human person, which for me is the imagination, like I mentioned earlier. And the problem that we have, more or less, is a problem of lack of imagination or lack of proper exploration of the imagination. And if you ask me what would be the contribution, or what should be the contribution, or what is the contribution of literature or poetry in the African setting, I think that, first of all, if it helps to open up the imagination. And let me say this, I think that, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, it goes beyond stringing words. Creativity is not about only when a poet is connected to the muse or to the imagination. is a creative impulse that can
Yes.
enable you do many things. It is not only directed towards stringing of words on paper.
What else can it help you do?
Imagination, for example, if you can imagine that this place that we are here in this studio can be turned around, is a thinking thing.
Oh, I see.
Is a process, is for you to think the unimaginable, for you to be able to conceptualize things from the abstract and say this thing can be possible. That is one thing that creativity, poetry does for the
So
individual.
if I get you right, you were saying that poetry can help spark creativity in individuals beyond the realms of literature. So by listening to poets or by writing poetry, it sparks your imagination and you can go on to do other creative things in various sectors.
Absolutely. I did talk about inspiration to
Yes,
inspire
yeah.
people. So that for me, those two things, the imagination and the
Inspiration.
inspiration, those two are key things for me. Let me give you a practical example.
Okay.
I'm a poet, but I imagine that we can have constant electricity in Nigeria, for example. And I think about it a lot. And I think that it is a possibility. I think that it is, and let me give you another practical example. You know, the road construction, for example. I don't think it is such a scientific thing, in quote, to do. Where I live, for example, everybody can, you know, create the what do you call it,
Interlocking blocks?
Interlocking blocks,
Okay.
you understand, and make our roads. Do you
Yeah,
understand what
yeah.
I'm saying? What I'm trying to say, in effect, is the power of the imagination.
Okay. So I'm going to pause you there and take you up a moment. Professor, would you agree that poetry has this capacity? Poetry can do more than just enjoying art and literature in the classroom or for the elites?
Well, all literature aim to entertain,
Yes.
so you can't put that aside.
Yes.
But in the process of entertaining, the writer has something philosophical to tell the truth. And what is the truth? If he looks at his environment and it's not what it should be, if he looks at and he knows the history of what life was at a certain time, and he'll have the tendency to compare his own environment as a country with other countries at certain times in history when this country was better, when these other countries came a borrowing. And he looks around now and sees those countries mistreating our country because we have gotten ourselves to a level that they do not consider us much. Now, the poet is likely to capture this. The expression is there because poetry has its own expression, and he has to, for his readers to enjoy what he's doing, he has to think of the technical words or the technicality of poetry writing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he needs to capture it, capture the content, capture the theme or the idea of what he wants to tell his reader
Okay.
or listener, because poetry you can perform.
Yes,
and
performance
you
poetry.
can do, and so as it is said that most people don't want to read, and so you can perform that poetry and they are ready to listen. And what are you talking about? That's very important.
Okay.
My economy, my country's economy is bad. You have to say it. And at times you need to say why it is this way. You know, why is the Niger Delta, where fish and the fauna and everything was so beautiful, say in the 50s
Yeah.
and 60s, where you could just walk down to a stream and catch fish
Yeah.
and pick fruits
Even till the 70s.
and do whatever you want to do. And people were healthy.
They lived
And
longer,
they
stronger.
lived longer. And suddenly, because up till now, when you go to the Niger Delta, I think young people die more than the
Older
older people. because I've been to certain weddings and events, and I see a lot of elderly people who have experienced that life, and so perhaps they've tried to keep to what they experienced.
That's a very...
So this is captured in the poetry, and you would love it when the right words are used to capture what the writer has to say.
Okay, so Rex, I'm going to take it back to you. From what you said, poetry has the capacity to connect with people at a subliminal level, bypassing prejudices, bypassing anger, emotions, and all of that, and connecting with them with the capacity to fascinate and inspire change. You said your concern was there seems to be a lack of inspiration. There's a lot to do. Why are we not seeing more poets engaging, going out? Why are we not seeing change makers engaging more poets to be able to connect with these people, more storytellers? In the old days, we had storytellers who went to the villages to connect with the people. Why are we not seeing a reawakening of poetry and storytellers reconnecting with our people to pass on the messages we desperately need to?
Okay, it is not a bypassing. You don't bypass emotions. I think that they are better expressed, not bypassed.
Okay.
And then the second thing also is that poetry, like Prof mentioned earlier, the trajectory of poetry is life, you know, and so it resonates with the society from its inception. And talk of orature, oral literature, folk tales, storytellers, you know, all of these things interwoven, you know, in telling stories in the poetic form. But as we are presently, you find that a whole lot of people that get involved in either the running of states don't understand the importance or the imports of the creative imagination. I mean, it's the truth. For instance, if you ask an employer who is best suited for a particular position that requires deep thought processes.
Yes.
I'm sure that many would say, get me an engineer or something like that.
Yes.
But I tell you that an employer who knows what he wants, goes for the poet. Why? It is a creative thing. The poet may not be able to give you the mechanical accuracy in terms of the XYZ of how you arrive at his imagination or his imaginative process. Okay, that is where you now require the technical person. He would think, for example, it's possible to create a sea in Abuja. For example, I'm just giving a practical example. I mean, it's absurd. But the technical person comes in to begin to look at that imagination. How can we...
If I hear you properly, I hear that if we begin to engage exactly our young people in poetry, what we're doing is like an introduction to creative thinking. So as they grow and spread into various forms of society, engineering, science, literature, other forms, that basic foundation of creativity begins to spring and blossom in their in various capacities.
Absolutely, but I've also been very careful not to keep limiting it to poetry. Now, because for me, although poetry sits at the foundation, the core of literature, I mean, Prof will agree with me that every form of, I mean, the novel is an 18th century, you know, event. Okay, so the drama, the sequence, culturally speaking, traditionally speaking, in the Western cultures, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Beowulf, or whatever it is, traditionally, you understand, is poetry. Okay, even with us here. So poetry sits at the foundation of creativity. That's the basics for me.
All right, so we've run out of time essentially. And no, Prof, just give me a minute. We've run out of time, and so I'd just like us to try and round up with just your last comment in about 30 seconds or about. So Prof, we'll start with you, and Rex, you round up.
Okay.
Yeah, you know that a lot of people who may pretend not to understand the power of literary creation They do. When it suits them. Most of our writers who have had to go into exile, or who have been killed, or who have been imprisoned, it was simply for saying the truth at a particular time.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the words that the leadership, or so to say at the time, does not want to hear. And so I think they know the power of poetry.
Absolutely.
It's and their fear of poetry is its power.
Yeah.
So they would rather not. Remember, there was a head of government who said, teachers teach nonsense. Was it Babangida or
I
someone?
understand, yes, I remember that
Teachers
period.
teach nonsense. And what is the nonsense? It's many students
the
at
imagination.
the time said NYSC came about because government wanted to control the thoughts that had been instilled in them
Yeah.
from the classroom
Yeah.
by the nonsense teachers taught them. And so they are aware of the strength
Of poetry.
poetry.
All right. Thank you very much, Madam. Rex, in rounding up, your thoughts.
But how can we talk about poetry without a short poem? I just want to just give a very short one, you know. Places of
Sure.
broken dreams. And the places of dreams have become the faces of graves. This land of the living where we're living in, phantoms and idolims on toil and death, a sure oblation to pour. Civilization jungles and cemeteries and mesmerized tangles and silvered lavatories and product of broken laboratories and sore infirmaries. These hopes in blazes are the lives of the races. Thank you.
Wow. Well, it's been fascinating having my guest today. We've been talking about World Poetry Day and the contributions of poetry to the African society. Rex, it's a pleasure having you as always.
My pleasure.
Prof, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
And by the way, I'm honored to be in this program with Prof.